I will have the disaster.
Это тоже часть общества.
En kalbi duygularımla
Kusurlarımız, hatalarımız olursa affola. Elçiye zeval olmaz. Elçiye zeval olmazdan herkese selamlar. Videolara ufak bir tatil arası verdim ama tabii gündem hep çok hareketli. Ortadoğu gündemi hep yoğun ve maalesef hep sorunlu. Gazze'de vahşet devam ediyor. İran hem İsrail hem Amerika tarafından saldırıya uğradı ve Katar'daki Amerikan üslerine saldırdı. Suriye maalesef bir türlü durulamıyor. Dürzi milisler ve Bedevi aşiretler arasında ciddi kayıpların olduğu çatışmalar yaşandı. Ve İsrail takip ettiği ayrılıkçı politikayla Dürzileri koruma bahanesiyle yine Suriye'ye saldırdı. Diğer yandan SDG ayak diriyor. Türkiye'nin Şam'a savunma ve askeri alanda kapasite gelişimine katkı sağlamasını bekliyorduk zaten. Ama şimdi Suriye'nin Türkiye'den resmi olarak da bu talepte bulunduğu duyuruldu. Bugün Orta Doğu'yu ilgilendiren tüm bu önemli konuları konuşacağız. Suriye'deki durum, Irak'taki İran yanlısı gruplar, Orta Doğu'da değişen güç dengeleri, Amerika'nın Orta Doğu politikası, Trump Doctrine'i nedir? Türkiye Körfez İşbirliği bölge için ne anlama geliyor? Washington'un önde gelen Orta Doğu ve özellikle Körfez bölgesi uzmanlarından biri konuğum. Giorgio Cafiero, Gulf State Analytics'in CEO'su, aynı zamanda Georgetown University'sinde yardımcı doçent ve American Security Project uzmanı. Yazılarını ve röportajlarını sık sık Al Jazeera, Gulf International Forum, The New Arab, Responsible Statecraft, Stimson Center ve Anvaj Medya'da görüyoruz. Çok kapsamlı bir röportaj oldu. Kaçırmayın derim. Ve tabii kanalıma abone olmayı da unutmayın. Hadi başlayalım. Hello Giorgio, thank you for joining Don't Shoot the Messenger. I would like to start our discussion with a question on Syria. With Iran's influence waning, Syria's territorial integrity now faces threats from Israel's separatist policy and the SDF's refusal to integrate into the Syrian army and to withdraw from the territories it occupies. Given the conflicting U.S. narratives, how do you assess the positions and likely moves of the key actors?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on as your guest. Really an honor to be with you. You know, at this point, a little more than half a year after the Assad regime fell, what we see is the relatively new central government in Syria really struggling to consolidate its power. The future of Syria as a sovereign and cohesive nation state very much called into question at this point. Given the background and the ideological nature of the HTS-dominated government, we know that different minority communities in Syria have huge concerns about the consolidation of the current Damascus government. And we've seen numerous episodes this year in which there have been some ugly clashes, you know, going back to March. There was that episode in which many Alawites were killed on the West Coast. And then earlier this month, of course, this being July 2025, we saw the gruesome violence that took place in southwestern Syria that involved the Druze communities. So at this point, it's quite clear that the SDF is rather suspicious of the new government in Syria. And while there have been efforts for the past few months to move the PKK-linked YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces toward a comprehensive deal with Damascus, this has been stalled because the SDF or YPG has a real different vision for the future of Syria than the al-Shara government. The al-Shara government would like to have a strong unitary state in Syria, whereas the SDF, YPG wants to have a lot more of a decentralized system. Maybe we can call that federalism. And so it's difficult for the two sides to sort of reach a comprehensive deal. In light of what took place in Soweto this month, I think the SDF, YPG has more leverage. The government in Damascus will probably have a harder time reaching such a deal with the SDF. Now, to talk about external actors, I think the Trump administration is quite aligned with Turkey in terms of wanting to see the central government in Syria consolidate its power and see to it that the SDF is integrated into the Syrian nation state. And I think this is obviously one of the big challenges that the Trump administration is facing in Syria right now. There could be a deal that's reached at some point, but I think the path to get there is going to be marked by many challenges. But ultimately, you have a lot of diversity in Syria, and many different visions for what the future should be like. And it's going to be really hard to bring these different groups and the central government together on the same page. Obviously, the Israeli factor is a really important part of the equation. Unlike Turkey, Israel is an actor that wants to see Syria fragmented. Regardless of what type of regime is in power in Damascus, the general view in Israel is that a strong, unified Syrian nation state will always pose a threat to Israel. And this is consistent with a decades-old Israeli foreign policy strategy of trying to deepen the divide between Arab governments and different minority communities. We've seen Israel try to stoke these divisions in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Sudan, now in Syria. This is ultimately part of Tel Aviv's agenda aimed at making Israel the dominant and hegemonic force in the Middle East. The Israelis certainly do not want to see to it that there could ever be a day in the future in which Syria is unified and potentially capable of countering Israeli domination in the region, which was something that did happen in Syria before the Arab Spring. We saw this at previous points in history when Syria was more unified. That certainly put a check on Israel's ability to dominate the region. And I think from Tel Aviv's perspective, the very fragile transition in Syria is an opportunity to sort of balkanize, fragment Syria. And we're seeing this with Israeli bombardments of the country, more Israeli theft of Syrian land. And this really started right after Assad fell on December 8th. I think it maybe was something like 24 hours after the former regime fell, the Israelis started bombing Damascus and other parts of the country. The new government had shown no hostility to Israel. This was completely unprovoked. But again, we need to understand this within the context of Israel's agenda, which is aimed at totally balkanizing and fragmenting Syria.
Thank you so much, Giorgio. Let's move to Iraq now. Iraq gets less attention than Iran and Syria, yet the coalition's mission is ending, and the US will probably maintain a more limited presence based on a bilateral agreement with Iraq. So with Iran-backed militias staying quiet during the recent Iran-Israel clashes, as you recently pointed out, what external factors now threaten Iraq's security?
I think it's important to, first of all, point out that in recent years, Iraq has made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of improving the overall security situation in the country, bringing more stability to Iraq. That being said, there are threats to Iraq's security and stability, and I would point to two specific ones. Number one, within the context of hostility between Iran and the American-Israeli alliance, always huge concerns that those hostilities are going to play out on Iraqi soil. Everyone remembers the killing of Qasem Soleimani and other episodes whereby tensions between the Tehran-led axis of resistance and the American-Israeli alliance led to acts of violence on Iraqi soil. And we saw during the 12-day war of June 2025 that both the leadership in Baghdad with Prime Minister Soudani at the helm and also various Tehran-aligned factions under the PMF umbrella really went out of their way to try to see to it that Iraq would be sort of sheltered from the violence between Iran on one side and Israel and the US on the other. They really showed a lot of restraint. So again, number one, the potential for regional hostilities to play out inside Iraq. Number two, it's the potential for the security crises in Syria to fully deteriorate and spill into Iraq. As I'm sure all your viewers know, there are remnants of Islamic State in Syria. Islamic State has been spilling some blood in Syria during the post-Assad period. There is an effort on the part of al-Sarraj's government to eradicate the ISIS threat. Nonetheless, the ISIS threat does continue to pose a threat not only to Syrians, but potentially this could spill into Iraq. And sort of within that context, we've seen the leadership in Baghdad try to establish a healthy and cooperative relationship with the new Syrian government. Certainly a complicated relationship given al-Shara's past in Iraq back in the 2000s, as well as his role in the Syrian al-Qaeda offshoot during the Syrian crisis. The ruling elites in Baghdad are very suspicious of al-Shara. Nonetheless, they are trying to make the most of the situation and to help Syria stabilize. And this has a lot to do with Iraq's own interests. If Syria is to completely slide into chaos, that could easily have very toxic and destabilizing effects on Iraq.
So I would like to hear your views on the current US policy in the Middle East now. So many analysts view the Biden's Middle East policy as a continuation of Trump's era. And you discussed the Trump Doctrine in one of your latest op-eds. Could you elaborate on this? What are the main components of that policy?
Well, I think Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East and frankly in other regions of the world is very erratic. It's very much driven by Trump's impulses. I think Trump's style is very much oriented around optics, making headlines, but there is not a tremendous amount of discipline on the part of the Trump administration when it comes to following through on diplomatic initiatives. I think Trump is clearly not an ideological leader. I think he's very much focused on transactions and really focused on his legacy, trying to do things that create the optics of being a peacemaker, a deal maker. We also need to see underneath all of that, there's a real tension between two camps that both have quite a bit of influence in the Trump administration. On one hand, you have the more hawkish elements. Among those figures, there are certainly some neoconservatives. I think obviously in the first Trump administration, we saw those figures such as Pompeo, Bolton, and so on. Today, I think Marco Rubio kind of represents those figures who very much sort of the traditional Republican hawks. We could describe some of them as being neoconservatives. Then on the other hand, we have the so-called restrainers. These restrainers are definitely not pacifists, but they set the bar much higher for when the United States should use military force to advance American interests on the international stage. These figures, such as J.D. Vance, tend to be quite skeptical when it comes to arguments that the U.S. Should be more militarily involved in the Middle East. They do not want to see the U.S. get bogged down in entanglements in this part of the world. And these figures really speak to an important part of Trump's base within the MAGA sort of America First base. And when Trump makes foreign policy decisions, I sort of think he oscillates between these two camps. And I think we sort of saw that back in June when the U.S. waged military strikes against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. He gave the hawks and the neoconservatives what they wanted. For decades, these figures in Washington had basically been dreaming and fantasizing about the day when the United States would bomb Iran. Past administrations, including very hawkish ones like George W. Bush's administration, never made that move, always fearful that bombing Iran would lead to unintended consequences and would be too risky. But Trump crossed that line. He bombed Iran. However, he also brought the Iranians and Israelis into a ceasefire right after that, and he did not follow up with additional bombings of Iran. And then he signaled his desire for diplomacy, diplomatic engagement with Tehran, which showed that he never abandoned the restrainer elements within his base. So I think probably what we're going to see throughout the remainder of Trump's term is a foreign policy that is very much shaped by the tensions between these two camps and different figures in the Republican Party, different figures on the American right will be competing to influence Trump either in the neoconservative direction or the restrainer direction. I don't think Trump is necessarily ideologically committed to one or the other. Having said that, I think Trump, given his own interests, political interests, also financial interests, does not want to see the U.S. dragged into a costly war in the Middle East, like what happened with the United States in Iraq during the 2000s. He knows that that would not be popular in the United States, and he knows that that would undermine his ability to achieve other goals that he has. So I think we'll see the Trump administration taking military action in certain situations, trying to come across as being very tough, conducting a very muscular US foreign policy, almost sort of in a Jacksonian tradition. But I think generally speaking, Trump is going to try to prevent any situation in which the US gets pulled into a long drawn out conflict in the Middle East.
So now let's turn to the shifting regional balance of power. Is Gulf-Turkey cooperation becoming a strategic partnership? Can this shift from rivalry to cooperation foster regional stability? And do you think is it sustainable?
It's a great question. You know, when we were having this conversation not too long ago, really, you know, in the late 2010s, there was a tremendous amount of tension between Turkey and some countries in the GCC, especially the United Arab Emirates, and the extent to which Turkey GCC relations have improved really since the historic Al-Ula agreement of January 2021, which resulted in the lifting of the blockade of Qatar. We've seen Turkey's relationships with both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi improve significantly. And I think the Gulf states, all 6 of the GCC states, place a lot of importance on Turkey as a partner across so many domains, whether we're talking about defense and security, trade, investment, regional diplomacy. I think Turkey clearly sees its relationship with the 6 Gulf Arab monarchies as very important to Turkey's national interests. This really takes place within the context of Turkey conducting a foreign policy that is much more pragmatic rather than ideological, really focused on trade and investment ties. I think really during the COVID period was a time when Turkey decided that it needed to really make economic interests more central to foreign policy decision making above any ideological factors. And the UAE's foreign policy also changed in that manner too. And at the same time, I think given the current climate in the region with the genocide in Gaza, all these unknown variables in Syria, tensions between the West and Iran, and between Israel and Iran, I think there's a lot of common cause between Turkey and the GCC states. I think Ankara and the key Gulf Arab capitals have many mutual interests. So really, to get to the heart of your question, I see Turkey and the GCC states continuing to get closer throughout this upcoming period, and for these partnerships to reach new heights. I think obviously there's a lot to say about how Syria fits into the equation. Turkey does not want to see Syria fragment and become a failed state. That would do so much to really threaten Turkey's security and economic interests, as well as societal stability inside Turkey. At the same time, GCC states are also very concerned about what would happen if you have power vacuums emerge inside Syria that could give opportunities to violent extremist groups to seize more power, a possible comeback of Islamic State. At the same time, Turkey and the GCC countries are on the same page when it comes to opposing Israeli aggression against post-Assad Syria. They want to see the reconstruction phase move ahead. When we talk about the reconstruction of Syria, Turkish Gulf Arab cooperation is going to be very important. And it's my opinion that this cooperation can serve as a driver of stability in the Middle East. I definitely believe so very strongly.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. And in relation to that, can we say that Saudi Arabia and Turkey emerged as the Middle East key powers in economic and military terms? Now, how Israel will navigate ties with these both countries?
Yeah, great question. I definitely do think that militarily and economically speaking, Turkey is the huge powerhouse in the Middle East and the Islamic world. and also Saudi Arabia and the UAE join Turkey in being the other two major countries with thriving economies. I think that the geopolitical order in the Middle East is going to be very much shaped by the foreign policies of these three countries. Again, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and we can also add Qatar to the mix as well. Now, when it comes to the Israeli factor, I think there's a lot of opposition to Israel's conduct in the region, in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, that is bringing Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the other GCC states more and more on the same page. As a consequence of everything that has happened since October 7th, the Saudis have been more outspoken in terms of condemning Israel. I think the Saudis are terrified of the ways in which Israeli behavior is fueling and unleashing higher levels of instability throughout the neighborhood. The Israeli bombing of Iran that started on June 13th was terrifying from the Saudi standpoint. The Saudis right now are focused on their economic transformation through Vision 2030. They're trying to bring in as much foreign direct investment as well as tourists to the kingdom as possible. And that's not going to work if the region is on fire. And similar to the other GCC states that also have their own national visions, they want to see stability prevail in the Gulf and in the Levant. And their view, again, is that Israel's conduct is really undermining hope for stability in the Middle East. And at the same time, Turkey certainly sees Israel's conduct in the region as very threatening. As we were discussing, Turkey does not want to see Syria fragment or balkanize. And I think everyone in Ankara understands that that's exactly what Israel is trying to do. Turkey and the GCC states have limited abilities to change Israel's conduct. I think they understand that the one power in the world that really has the leverage to reign in Israel is the United States. So we definitely know that Turkey and the GCC states are trying to convince the Trump administration to reign in Israel. And I think when it comes to these efforts to influence Washington's foreign policy, we're going to see Turkey and Saudi Arabia being very much on the same page when it comes to Israel-related issues.
Giorgio, thank you so much for your great insights, for your time. It was a great interview.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.